Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the June 25th session of the Governance Subcommittee. We have uh, several things on the agenda. I suspect we may not go as long as an hour and a half, but of course, if we need the whole hour and a half, we will take it. Um, the first thing on the agenda is a part of the OPDC complaint policy, the part that has to do with the board. The rest is still a work in progress, as I understand it. Heather Kessinger is here again to help us go through the materials that she provided. I'll let Heather go ahead and say whatever she wants to say about those materials, and then I'll open it up for comments or questions that people may have. So Heather, go ahead.
Hello, Commission, Vice Chair Vandenberg, Commissioner Nab, Nelson, and Kay. Heather Kessinger, Senior Policy Analyst. And I do have some slides. If Mark, please show the slides. So those materials that I sent to you previously this week, very rough draft of what we have in the policy, but each day goes by and gets edited and drafted. So this work session will be really helpful to be able to engage with you members. Next slide, Mara. So before we go into the materials, I do want to provide you an update of where we are at with the complaint policy and procedures. The first draft has been completed, and we sent out the first draft of the policy to subject matter experts within the agency. So it's gone out to our child division, child support, human resources, appellate, and so they've had their first review, have left comments in, addressed risks, and all those beneficial things for creating a policy. And from that and the responses we received, I have started setting up work sessions with the different divisions and sections in the agency for, types of claims they receive, review processes, investigations, and resolutions. So the first work session I've had was last week. I had a really good work session with our HR department where we reviewed and really discussed risks of complaints that around internal complaints, especially with staff, and the discussion of the risk, because our agency does have 3 collective bargaining agreements, and how to address those. And so we had good conversation and really discussed the 2 lenses on the policy. And from that discussion and from comments that I received from other SMEs, subject matter experts throughout the agency, it's been suggested that we submit for legal review, really because of all the risks that play into this big policy, because we're dealing with external complaints from providers, complaints on possible child division attorneys, which fall into the attorneys and employee, internal complaints on a director, board, all of it. So we submitted the policy to Department of Justice, and they have completed their first, just a high-level review to bring me back comments and suggestions. And this policy will continue to have Department of Justice review on it due to agency risk within it. The policy itself is actually going to go into 2 different review departments within Department of Justice. We have our attorneys that represent our agency that are reviewing the policy. And we also have labor attorneys with the Department of Justice that specialize in labors and unions, and they will be taking a look at the policy as well to provide feedback, suggestions, and advice. And next week, I have scheduled first round of work sessions with our child support and development division, because they do work with our complaints that they receive from providers and review there. So they do have components in the policy, and we'll be starting our work sessions to address the comments that we received from staff and from DOJ. And
Heather, will you take questions as we go along, or do you want to
yes,
wait till the end?
absolutely, no, absolutely. This is engaging, so we can do questions as we go.
Great. Philippe, want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was hoping you could speak a little bit, and I apologize if you've done this already, and I'm just like not remembering. But could you speak a little bit about the scope of your thinking of this complaint process? Is this supposed to encompass um, agency function, attorney functions, so if a individual had a complaint against an attorney funded through OPD, um, is this would this complaint policy apply to that type of function, or is this about agency issues or board issues, or what's the scope of this complaint policy? What is it intended to encompass?
Yes, the scope is to encompass all types of complaints that our agency can receive. And that would include provider, contractor, complaints, internal staff, say trial division attorneys, because they are attorneys and staff, against the board, executive director, public meetings, comments. So currently, right now, our agency, we have a complaint process, but it really covers, like, HR has a process for staff, and trial support and development has a process for their complaints. But we need to create something that encompasses all types of complaints and put them into a tracking system, and being able to know how many complaints we have. Are they being resolved? Are they a review process? Are they in investigations? What is a resolution? And so really it's looking at, the best way I would describe it is we're really looking at a way to make it efficient and being able to encompass them all, so we know we have a pulse from the agency of what is happening.
Let me add to that by saying that the complaint policy that exists now is inherited from the previous commission and agency and includes elements that no longer exist in the real world. For example, an internal lawyer within our agency. So the policy has to be uh, changed. And I think that the thinking is that as long as we have to change it, we might as well make it as comprehensive and clear and effective, workable, and trackable as possible.
So Mara, next slide, please. So on the next slide, I've included the materials that in that memo I sent to you. I had really pulled over just a copy and paste of what we have in the draft. And as I said, it was just a draft. I did take language from your bylaws that you have, because there are sections within your bylaws that did address complaints. And so for consistency, I brought over that language to begin the whole. So in the draft, we have the board can receive complaints regarding OPDC policies or related administrative practices. It has been recommended by DOJ that within our drafted policy that we rewrite, because we want to make sure that we include the language that our policies, the lens is we want to be looking at the operation side of it, the agency operation side of it. So the policies and related administrative services, we want to make sure that we have strong language in there that these types of complaints will be directed to our executive director, and the complaints. And then in addition, any complaints that are on the executive director will go to the chair. And that is a suggestion from DOJ. And of course, we will go back and research and we will run it through SMEs, but at this time, that is a suggestion for an updated language. And in addition to that, the next one is the chair will have sole discretion either to place the complaint on the agenda or to refer the matter to the executive director for investigation. Open for discussion. DOJ also recommended what is our determination process? Like, what is the discretion that the chair has to be able to make that decision? And so there was a call out that they had. They wanted to know what is the discretion where the chair is making that decision. So recommendation is what is a determination process to add to a complaint? for the chair to be able to decide if that's an agenda item or to refer it to the executive director. So stronger language is what is recommended. And that is the piece here where open for discussion with the board as subject matter experts as well, on how we could move that piece forward, on how do we develop something for the chair, how they make that decision. And so that might be something we work with. Maybe we have language in the policy and then we work on more in process of how a chair makes that decision. So.
Heather, I was confused by something in the written materials. Um, so in the written materials where it says complaints received by the board, so at first it says the letter to the chair of the board, blah blah blah. But then in the after paragraph B, it says all complaints received by the board or complaints referred to the executive director must be submitted by the portal. The board will either refer the complainant to submit their complaint in writing using the portal, or um, if the complaint has, if the complainant has already sent a letter to the chair of the board, which is what it says in paragraph A, then isn't, and then the chair decides what to do with it. Where does it come in that the board will refer the complainant to? I don't understand how this one comes in. If is it if the board, if somebody else on the board gets a complaint, they'll, or if somebody on the board gets an oral complaint, then they tell the person to submit the complaint in writing.
Yes, and we could clean up the language.
Yeah, the
And
whole thing is so if a person addresses a letter to the chair of the board, does that's in subsection A,
Mhm.
does that not go through the portal? Because it doesn't say that the chair should then put it in the portal. It says the chair has the discretion of whether to put it on the agenda of a
Mhm.
meeting or refer it to the executive director. Is the chair also supposed to put the written letter into the portal so that it can be tracked? And then if somebody else on the board gets a complaint, I assume that's what's down in this paragraph that comes after B. The whole thing didn't
I
fit
agree.
together very clearly for
No,
me.
no, I agree. And we have this addressed on the next slide as well, where we need to have, it kind of contradicts. And so we need to go back and clean up the language and make that determination of how to make the determination of when they receive the complaint and when to address it to the board or when I submit. Mark, can you go to the next slide,
No,
please?
well, let me keep
Oh,
going on this for a
go
minute,
ahead.
please. Um, this may just be a personal preference, and if
Mhm.
so, you can treat it as such. But I would like to see less verbosity and more, here are the steps.
Okay.
You know, because
Mhm.
because if somebody's external to the agency and to the board is going to be looking at how to file a complaint, um, that they want the board to be able to deal with. That's what you're talking about here, right?
Mhm.
I want them to, I don't want them to have to interpret this. I want them to be able to
Okay.
see a clear 1, 2, 3, 4, these are the steps. And I think we need to be sensitive to the probability that some people who have complaints don't have bachelor's degrees and law degrees.
Mhm.
They may not even have high school degrees. So
Mhm.
I think the the simpler we can make this, the less verbose and the simpler we can make this is going to lead us to a more effective and better used policy.
I agree. And providing the steps and that plain language, so that way it is easy for them to understand when they read and know the next steps. Also, in addition to, I'll add to that, we'll have the policy, but on the website as well, is when this becomes effective, we will have instructions. So a process, external instructions. So if someone is filing a complaint, they could follow the, depending on the type of complaint there'll be an instruction manual for them to be able to follow, to be able to submit a complaint. So
well, even those of us with advanced degrees have to be able to figure out what to do when we get a complaint. So,
yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I have a quick question, and that is, Heather, I mean, is this something that would be reduced to an administrative rule? I mean, the complaint procedure, it's just sort of a threshold question because I'm not sure what landscape we're in.
That I agree. I will have to ask my manager and our rules coordinator if that is a direction of where this would go.
Yeah, because
Mhm.
you know, if it is, I'm sort of concerned even about sort of diving into this without, you know, going through the steps that we might have to go through. And I know we're not used to thinking that way because we haven't been in that structure in the same way as we are now. So yeah, you know, I'm just concerned about whether even having this preliminary discussion about it is sort of the right order. I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm just raising it as something that we should be thinking about when we're thinking about the policy as a whole. And I have so many questions. I mean, thank you for diving into this. I think it's hard, right? It's hard because there's so many concerns. You know, I mean, the other thing that I had a question about was that you said there were a couple of attorneys who are reviewing this at DOJ, and I'm wondering if it's also being sort of reviewed from the risk management point of view. You know, again, another thought that I had randomly was whether this would be some exhaustion of an administrative procedure before, you know, potential litigation and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, I mean, I think I'm trying to contextualize this effort, you know, within sort of the administrative structure that we're in, and just trying to wrap my head about it. And I'm sure you're thinking about those things too, but yeah, they're just random thoughts running through my head right now about this.
But it's helpful.
Okay.
So Mara, next slide, please. So the next section I have here is this was the next section within the policy where started drafting more of the complaints received, say, regarding the board. And so in the draft, we have the board will review and accept for consideration a complaint filed by any person, group, or persons or the board on its own action that is specific as to the conduct upon which the complaint is based. With review and discussion with DOJ as well, we're looking at updating that language to more align with the section that's above, where it's we want to update that language of the board's authority. What is the board's authority? And the executive director's authority, and for review and consideration of complaints filed. Because as I had mentioned on the last slide, that's where we really, if it's agency operational policies and administrative work, those should be the authority of the executive director. And so we're really looking to clean up the language of who has authority of review when it comes to complaints received and complaints regarding the board. And This will go under more review. We talked about more research and comparing what other boards and commissions have done. So I just wanted to have a call out because that is an update that's been reviewed since you received your memo for today. The other piece as well is we had discussed, I've discussed with Vice Chair previously to determine escalation process, who reviews complaints. And in the draft right now, we have, say, if it's a complaint against a board member or a commission meeting or a public comment, those will be overseen by chair. Complaints on the chair, overseen by vice chair. And legislative committee chair would oversee complaints on chair and vice chair. And OPDC's executive director would oversee complaints made on the board. Recommendation for review. Once again, this is something we're going to go back and take another look at. The DOJ stated in my call with them, complaints on the board or commission should be overseen by the executive director, and complaints on the OPDC executive director should be overseen by the chair and then forwarded to DOJ. So this was in discussion and a recommendation, and we're going to be going back and reviewing this more in depth while we are working with the drafts and reviews and stuff. So I wanted to bring that is also an update on the memo that I had sent out earlier. Next slide, Mark. So for engagement and stuff, really today's meeting was like, I really wanted to have some engagement, get feedback, any questions, concerns. So I've come up with a few questions, and in addition, at the end, if you have some as well, just to kind of broaden the lens for while we work on this and get some of your input as well. In the last meeting, you had asked, I think the commissioner had asked, asked, what is our definition for a complaint? And we've been discussing here within the agency and trying to come up with what our definition is going to be. And then we've decided to even branch out more from that and come up with a definition of what is an internal complaint and what is an external complaint. So it was a great question to ask. It got us all conversation and coming up with what we all feel the definition should be, but we branched out and are going to be putting in internal and external complaint but my question too is how do you all feel? Like, what is your interpretation of what is an external complaint? Like, what would you consider external complaint? Because here's an example. Maybe you have someone who thinks they should be paid more money, but we're in contracts. I'm just throwing out, I'm just something random. So they want their contract changed. Is that a complaint? Or is that maybe someone who just wants a little more money? Or was there something unethical and then they're filing a complaint? It kind of that's where some of our discussions have been lying, is what is a true complaint?
Let me, I don't see any hands up, so I'll talk. I think it's really important to have a clear definition of what the board has authority over and what the board does not have authority over. I am unaware, so I'm always open to being corrected, but I am unaware that the board has any authority over how much the agency pays any individual contractor or any individual hourly worker. And so I would like a definition of complaints that the board will entertain, regardless of how they're submitted. I would like a definition that outlines what the board actually has authority to do anything about. And I think that that would be helpful both for people making a complaint and for whatever board member receives that input, I
Mhm.
would like to be able to say, for example, you can go ahead and submit this through the portal, but you need to know that this is not an area that the board has authority to address,
Mhm. I
right?
like that.
And so that's one place I would start out with coming up with some guidelines or definitions. Um, I'm also wondering, so this is more of a wondering than a suggestion, but I know that sometimes people have suggestions or input that isn't really a complaint. It's just, I've been thinking about this and that, about what's going on at OPDC, and it just sort of seems to me that it might be useful for ABC to happen. I would like to have a definition or even a title that didn't limit this to "I'm pissed off," right? I would like to be able to get people's constructive criticism. I would like to be able to get people's imaginative ideas. I mean, Lord knows we don't have all the answers to this nonsense. I mean, this is difficult stuff. So if there was a way to call this not a complaint policy, if there was a way to call this an input policy, or I don't know if you have to distinguish the pissed off sorts of input from the helpful suggestion sorts of input. I don't, we should be welcoming input, even if it's not technically a complaint.
Susan, can I maybe give a little bit of a different perspective on that?
I would expect no less.
I mean, I have found within my state agency, I've found it very helpful to have very well-defined um, parameters for our mandate. And I think this is something you were talking about in terms of, you can come to us with whatever, but if we have no jurisdiction over it. And so, obviously we in kind of public service and dealing with folks who are facing really tough circumstances, you meet a lot of people who have exhausted resources and are in tough situations. And I think being able to define the scope of what you can work with and what you can help has been incredibly helpful for my agency and for my current role. So I think that, on top of that, as a practitioner, someone who's worked with low income folks in these situations for a long time, I hate that the world just gives people another option when it is meaningless. Like, I think it's our obligation to tell people that there's no remedy if there's no remedy, rather than just kind of making up another place you might be able to go where you're not going to get help. So I really I'm pro rigid definitions of what we can do. And I don't think it's necessarily at odds with the idea of soliciting input. But I think both in terms of what you're going to get on the other end of it, and in fairness to the people who are complaining, that, for example, if it's, lawyer malfeasance, that the bar association is the appropriate place to go for that.
So
Um,
I don't think we disagree with each other, Philippe. When I was suggesting that some people might have suggestions that aren't complaints, I would expect those to also fit within the limits of what we have the authority to deal with. So I don't think I disagree. I don't think we disagree with each other. Tell me if I'm wrong.
no, well, I mean, I think that's right, as long as that part that part is defined, the
Yeah,
limitations of what
no,
we can do.
I think it has to be defined. Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, are we anticipating quality of service type complaints from clients in this procedure? Anyone, I mean, Heather or anyone?
Uh, quality of service type of complaints. Well, if we receive a complaint, it will be vetted and then it will go through preliminary review. And then within preliminary review, we determine if there's an investigation. So within that, we will be establishing response times, communication to the person who submitted the complaint. If there's an investigation, we have to open up communications with people who are being investigated. So part of this is making sure that we do provide quality service. This is why we are coming in to develop this process with the policy. So as an agency, we can stand up, you know, a good process that really aligns also with our customer service policy and the customer service procedures that we're developing as well.
But this wouldn't be anything that's within the board's authority. A quality of service complaint would be for the agency, not for the board.
Yes, and then that would go over to executive director.
Right.
But theoretically, this policy is intended, or at least the policy that we're speaking about more broadly, the is intended to cover all of that, right? Both
Right.
in terms of the board and quality of service type complaints, which, you know, and I'll just editorialize, seems a little bit overambitious in my mind.
So the one that's before us today is complaints either to or about the board.
Correct.
All these other ones,
Mhm.
quality of service complaints, all these other kinds of complaints are still, we haven't seen anything about that. That's still part of the work in progress.
That's correct. And
Yeah.
you will be seeing those in future meetings.
And the work group that we were supposed to see some of that in next week has been canceled because the material isn't ready yet.
It's still with DOJ.
Right.
Mhm. Yes.
Anything else on the specific part of the work in progress that's before us today? In other words, complaints to the board and complaints about the board.
Well, I have my next question was how will commission members determine that a complaint should be submitted as a public comment or submitted through the OPDC complaint process? This is another, and I think this piggybacks a little bit about what we were just discussing, where if someone has a suggestion for the board, could that be recommended that they submit a public comment versus a complaint? So this was DOJ had brought up this conversation as well as what is the difference between a public comment and a complaint and how we will treat those as well. So I included that as a question to have us start really thinking about that as we work on the policy and the process as well, and determining your steps of if we receive a complaint, should it be recommended as a public comment, or do you recommend that they submit that through OPDC complaint portal?
Right, that's a great question. Huh.
And two, we don't have to have an answer today. It's just that planting the seed of here's another one that we should really be thinking about taking into consideration when we work through this development.
I assume that if any of us come up with any interesting or even uninteresting ideas about how to answer this question, we can email them to you.
Yes, and I have a slide towards the end with the email address as well.
Has there been any I'm not aware of complaints about the board that have been submitted to the agency. Is there any history of that? In the time that I've been on the board, I have not been aware of anything like that.
I would have to ask to find out.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to know if they have been, without attribution about who made them or anything. It would be interesting to know what the content
Mhm.
of those complaints were, because we certainly know the kinds of things that people put in public comments because we get them.
Mhm.
And it would be interesting to know if there have been complaints made about the board or about something within the board's area of of authority that haven't been made as public comments. It'd be interesting to be able to see if the content was different in it in some way. That might help to answer this question.
Mhm.
I would just suggest, and I mean, I think that this is very much in the weeds, but well, why not have both as avenues? It seems like it would be a no-brainer to provide different avenues for those types of complaints. But again, I'll reiterate what both Susan and I said earlier, that I think, having a forum that provides a sounding box without having a definition of what's within control of that forum is silly. And so, I think defining what the commission can do vis-a-vis complaints is almost more important than how those complaints get to the commission, or the process that those are heard by. I think defining which ones they actually have the ability to adjudicate.
Yes. And I agree, and that has been a topic of discussion with DOJ this week, is what is truly the board's authority? And so that is something that we are reviewing and researching. And within that research, we can get a definition drafted, and then be able to bring that back and then kind of vet that out with you guys as well. And then I had another question as well that I thought of after conversations with DOJ and some previous conversations I've had with all of you. What barriers do commission members perceive when receiving complaints from a person, and then providing them guidance for public comment or recommending submitting a complaint to OPDC?
What barriers? Is that what you said?
Barriers.
Mhm.
And this could be another one that's a little more to think out, because this too could be something that's more in process. Stuff for us to consider. So when we are writing that instruction manual to put on the website, we can be aware of what kind of barriers we may come across when we need to recommend someone to submit that complaint.
Heather, are you talking about things like language barriers or disability?
And yeah, language barriers,
Disability, yeah.
disability.
Are you talking about what barriers we want to impose or what barriers we think people will experience?
People will experience, or even board members on, I think we touched on it earlier, having instructions, step-by-step instructions of how to suggest someone to submit either a public comment or that is a complaint. Just I think we covered a bit of it earlier with having clear instructions, but brainstorming on what other types of instances you have when you're working and doing yours and you get, so say if someone walks up to you on this board. I'm just trying to brainstorm of what potential situations are out there. So that way, when we write instructions, we've thought it through. I mean, of course, other things may come down the road and then we go back and update, but just planting that seed so we can put some thought into it.
I'm gonna just reiterate what I said before. I think that, and obviously there's just so much to say about accessibility in terms of language access and disability access, and all of those. And clearly any policy is meaningless if it doesn't incorporate those bedrock principles and all of the work that's already been done in that space. But I just want to say, and I said this before, I think one thing I hate seeing from government agencies and legal services is giving people false hope and just creating more of a runaround for people who have already been through a lot and working through a lot. And so I think laying out very clearly what can happen and how that can happen is an important part of making this client-centered and at least accessible or meaningful for people who will be utilizing it, both in terms of people who've received public defense services. And so um, having a broad policy that welcomes everything and um, promises the world is I think less useful than having a narrow policy that tells people what they can expect and how they expect it and gives very limited sets of what is possible. So that's my thoughts on the matter.
I'm going to agree with Philippe on that one. Not giving people false hope is good. We are now past the time on the agenda for this discussion,
Yeah.
and I think that's okay because I think some of the other discussions won't go as long as the agenda indicates, but I did want to call that to everybody's attention. So how much more do you want to do with us, Heather?
I think I could get this wrapped up and, well, we have one next question, Mark, maybe next slide, and I'll be fine. One last question. The others is additional questions, concerns that we've been talking through. And I did provide my email. So if you wanted to reach out and provide any questions or concerns, please email me. And then in the policy, there is going to be a section for reporting. This is how many complaints, how many have been resolved, how many are pending. And so my question is for the board, how often would you want to see reports for complaints? Would it be quarterly, biannually, or annually? And what would these reports, look like? Like you want to have a providers, depending. And we could come back to this one as well, but because I don't want to. It's on time. Keep you on time.
Again, are we talking about the broader complaint?
Broader.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. It might be premature to talk about that. I would think quarterly, I mean, off the top of my head.
Mhm. Well, and this question too, we could actually bring into our work group session when we review the policy as a whole. And so
Yeah.
I could keep this question and bring it to a work group session.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yes. And then the last slide is just an update on the estimated timeline. So due to the policy being with DOJ, Mara, can you go back one more? There we go. I did do an update on an estimated timeline due to DOJ and legal review. So in this timeline, I've updated, commission work group session, commission meetings, pending DOJ reviews. But I'm trying to keep us on a timeline so we could be transparent, so we communicate and still continue working together because, on reviews of this policy and addressing any risks and concerns to be put it together. So I just wanted to let you know there has been an update. So due to these DOJ reviews, because they are going to be reviewing collective bargaining agreements and all that fun stuff with it.
Heather, this is amazingly difficult and detailed work that you're involved in.
Many moving parts.
Lots of moving parts and lots of people with ideas and issues. And now that the DOJ is also involved, that's sort of on steroids. So I think you have our admiration and sympathy in being in charge of this task. And thank you so much
Yes.
for your clear
Well, I appreciate
presentation.
the time and being able to receive some feedback and questions. So thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks everybody for really good input. The next thing on our agenda is the board key performance metrics. And I think I saw Kim here before, but she doesn't look like she's here now. So there were three or four that we've been discussing, and I want to start with the first one. What is our mission? So our role on this subcommittee right now is to figure out what, if anything, we want to give to the board to review before the board has to answer the board KPMs. Our job right now is not to talk about changes to the bylaws. It may be that down the line, the board as a whole wants to think about changes to the way our mission is described in the bylaws. We have not been given that mandate. So that is not on the table. And I have been made aware that if we ever do get to the point of wanting to change the definition of the mission in the bylaws, that will have a domino effect on some other things that go on inside the agency. So we really can't undertake that now, even if we wanted to go outside of our mandate, without having a lot more information. So what is before us is, let me put the question this way. When board members get asked whether our mission is, I can't remember the exact questions, unfortunately, I have them here someplace. When people are asked about our mission, do we want to just not say anything in this document that we're going to be giving people to review and just let people answer based on whatever they think our mission is? Or do we want to go ahead and give some ideas about what our mission is along the lines of what we were talking about last time? What we were talking about last time was the various kinds of responsibilities we have, the various parts of our mission. We were talking about having some responsibilities toward Oregon citizens and the legislature, having some responsibilities toward public defense providers, having some responsibilities toward public defense clients, talked about core responsibilities. We can either put something together or we can say everybody can answer questions based on their own sense of what our mission is. Similarly, with the second thing we were talking about, some people last year found the question about our role as a public representative to be difficult to answer because they were unclear about how to think through our role as a public representative. One thing I know will be in this memo that we circulate to people is Mara has kept a list since the KPMs last year of all the things that the commission has addressed and taken care of over the course of the year. So a way to save people from having to go back through a year of agendas and notes that they've taken about meetings to feel up to date in order to answer those questions. So what's before us is whether we want to leave that memo to consist only of Mara's list of the year's activities, or we want to add some things to consider about what our mission is and what our role as a public representative is. So if any of the three of you have any input on that, now's the time.
I mean, I think it's helpful to provide the mission statement. Not that, and I kind of think that it's up to everyone to interpret it themselves. So I don't know that we should provide interpretation, but just, some context. Here's the mission. And I do think it's helpful to just, to some extent, the questions are, the interpretation of the questions is up to each individual. commissioner. And so if it's a bad question, maybe it is a bad question. Maybe that's the reality of it.
Yeah. So when you say tell people what the mission is, you mean just reiterate what's in the bylaws?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Uh, Leslie, do you feel any different?
A little bit. I mean, I think we should provide the mission statement, and I think we, at a minimum should, as a board, should have a shared understanding of what the mission statement means. I don't think it should be subject, to wide sort of interpretation. I mean, I think it is the touchstone, um, for the organization, and yeah, if we have widely differing interpretations of what it means, then we should probably talk about it so that we can all be on the same page, just as sort of preliminary matter, I guess, is what I would think about that.
So here's an alternative suggestion. Um, Certainly circulate Mara's list of what the commission has accomplished, has done over the years. It's just a question. It's not an editorialized statement. It's just a list of here's what's been on our agendas and here's what we've voted on, here's what we've done, right? So just gleaning from the public record. We could, before these KPMs come out, have a work group where anybody who wants to come and talk about the KPMs can come and talk about what our mission is and talk about what our role is as a public representative. And that way, there would be a discussion, and then people could go away from that discussion with their own interpretation and answer the KPMs that way. People who didn't care about discussing it wouldn't have to come to the work group. How would that feel to people? Is that a way to deal with this that makes sense? Yes, no?
I think it's a good idea. I mean, certainly for me as a new board member, it would be helpful.
Yeah,
Commissioner.
I agree too on that for sure.
Okay, Philippe, what do you think?
I'm happy to discuss it. I think it's helpful to discuss it,
Okay,
I I think that hopefully there is a common understanding we can all have. I think also there may not be. There
there
may
may not be, which is
there
interest, which would be interesting to find out.
yeah.
Okay, all right, so we can move on. The next thing on the agenda, and we're now ahead of ourselves, is the audit committee charter. So, um, I have over the last little while spent more time reading about internal audits and things associated with internal audits, talking to um, our chief audit executive about what he thinks is needed for internal audits, hearing some input from providers and other stakeholders about what they think the audit committee should be look like and do. Um, And one of the conclusions that I think our chief audit executive and I have come to is that everybody who's been thinking about this and giving input on this, that we're not all working from a common sense of a common knowledge base and a common understanding and a common agreement about what an internal audit is all about and how it should proceed effectively. And so before we try to put together another audit committee charter, um, Scott and I both have agreed, at least in our opinion, it's important to educate everyone on what this is all about. And we are looking into being educated by somebody from DAS who is involved in the internal audit division at DAS, who probably through a work group or some kind of special education meeting that would be obviously recorded and people could watch if they couldn't come, so that we all understand the terms, we all understand what internal audit does, we all understand what the principles are that govern it, we all understand what related sorts of things go on that aren't exactly internal audits but are related to internal audits, how internal audits can be done effectively, how an internal audit in an agency with a commission like ours is different from an internal audit in an agency without a commission like the military department. And I'm raising that because the current chair of our internal audit committee is from the military department. And so her ideas may, wonderful as they are, may not be appropriate for us. Um, and so my report on this is that we are working on seeing what we can put together as a succinct and effective educational meeting that would help us all be on the same page. And hopefully, once we're all on the same page, we will have an easier time putting together something that we can all agree will give us an effective internal audit function. And I'd love to have feedback on that. I would also love to have your sense of what the tension points are, just on everything we've done on this so far, your sense of what the tension points are that we're dealing with. I would like to be able to communicate those to the person who's going to be doing the education. And it will definitely be somebody from outside OPDC, not currently on our internal audit committee. Be able to communicate to that person so that the education can cover those points. I have gone through a lot of our old meetings and my notes on them, and I've come up with a list of what I think some of the tension points are. But if you have good ideas on where those might be, I would love to hear them now, or you can send a note to Mara and she can make them available. Any sense?
You know,
Yeah.
yeah, without knowing the history so well, it would be helpful to see the list, I guess, that you've been able to aggregate and, so we can respond to it. I mean, to see if there's something else that's missing, I guess.
Well, let me tell you what I've got so far. It will take me a minute to pull that document up on my computer. So hold on. Excuse me for not having it handy, but I'll get it in just a second. So some of the tension points that I'm aware of. First of all, there's a lot of stress and tension about whether audit committee meetings should be public or private meetings. In other words, whether they should be subject to the public meeting laws or not. And there have been a lot of opinions given both internally and externally, and I would refer you to Mr. Doherty's public comment from our last commission meeting about whether we are required to make audit committee meetings public meetings. There is some debate on that. And so that's definitely one tension point. Another tension point is who should be on an internal audit committee? What is the right balance of staff members, agency staff members, and people who are not agency staff members. Everybody agrees that there should be at least one board member on the audit committee. But beyond that, there are lots of different points of view. And of course, everyone with an opinion on this has a lot of what they consider to be good reasons for wanting it their way. So one approach that may work for a lot of people is to have four internal members, not including the executive director or the deputy. So four staff members, four external members, and who those external members should be is certainly up for discussion. Some people won't like that compromise position. And so that's an area where one of the things I think we need to be educated on is what combination of people on an audit committee will further an effective internal audit for an agency like ours. And so that's a tension point. Another tension point is getting, as I've come to understand internal audits, it's important that the agency staff have trust in the internal audit function, trust that it will not be something where it's set out to, is sort of a gotcha approach to set out to get people in trouble. And so one issue is how to set up an internal audit committee so that it and the internal audit function and the chief audit executive have the trust of staff. So obviously that overlaps with a lot of these other, a lot of these issues are in many ways overlapping. Another issue that has come up for debate is who appoints the audit committee members. One answer is if the board appoints them, that's one approach. If the board appoints the audit committee members, then there's an argument that the audit committee becomes a subcommittee of the board or some kind of board associated committee, and then it would have to be a public meeting. But for the people who think that having a public meeting for the internal audit committee would make the internal audit committee less effective in doing an internal audit, having the board appoint the committee members would be dysfunctional. And so then, if not the board, who will appoint them? And so there are various possibilities for that. And so that is an area of tension. One of the things, so two of the functions that an internal audit committee might have is evaluating whether this chief audit executive is doing a competent job and reporting on that to the executive director. But the other is evaluating whether the executive director is responding appropriately to internal audit findings and recommendations. And so there's some tension around dealing with potential conflicts of interest and dynamics with how all that gets set up. So going through all of my notes about past discussions on this, those are the tension points that I've identified. And I am pretty sure that with the right education and the right understanding about what an effective internal audit is and what an effective internal audit committee does, we should be able to come up with answers to those tension points that make some sense. I'm also pretty sure that unless we're all on the same page about those things, about what an internal audit is all about, we will just keep fighting with each other about all this. So if you all have thought about it or want to think about it and think of other tension points, I'd love to know what they are. I don't think at this point we're ready to discuss solutions because we're not all on the same page. So that's my current thinking about this whole situation, and I would love to hear yours. Leslie, if you're talking, we can't hear you because you're.
Is there history in other agencies with a commission kind of structure on internal audit committees? I mean, are we trying to reinvent the wheel?
So what I have two things on that. I
Mhm.
have some hearsay. I have some secondhand um, comments that have been given to me by a number of different people about how it works at other agencies. I have audit committee charters from a number of other executive branch agencies, but all of the charters that I have are from either 2018 or 2019. I don't have any current charters. And I believe that regulations and internal documents at Secretary of State's office and at Justice have changed since 2018 and 2019. So if, as I hope, someone from DAS can come and do the education that we need, that question will be answered.
Okay.
I personally, as I'm sure is true of all three of you other volunteers on this committee, don't have time to go talk to all the other. I don't even have time to find out which other agencies have commissions that are like ours. Now, one agency that I know of that has a commission that has public meetings is PERS. But PERS is a very different kind of an agency from ours, right? And they have certain kinds of fiduciary duties that we don't have that causes them to have public meetings. So that's not a good comparison as far as I'm aware.
Mhm.
If I can just add, and I think that this builds on both prior comments. I mean, I really do feel like we're not experts in this. Like there are people who are experts in audits. There are best practices that we're unaware of. It seems like, where our involvement should be more high level and less granular, in terms of our our participation. I would hope and trust that, along all of these policies and procedures that there are subject matter experts who are thinking of this and giving it to us for approval. And so I would hope that, in terms of the audit committee, that um, that our involvement is essentially approving the what is a best practice, because again, I think I was a pretty good public defender, but I've never been a state auditor
Yeah,
or.
which is why I've spent more time than I care to think about trying to learn about internal audits. So the problem, Philippe, is that the two subject matter experts that we have to hand are our chief audit executive and the chair of the audit committee. And they are both the ones who gave us the draft audit committee charter that we then had a lot of problems with on this subcommittee and redrafted. And that is the basis of all the fear and loathing and complaints and suggestions about why we're doing it wrong that we've been getting, which is why I want to turn to a subject matter expert who is not involved in what's already gone on, and consequently somebody from DAS. So that's exactly my thought. We need that expert advice. And once we get it, and by the way, DOJ has some thoughts about all this as well. So so once we get that advice, then I think we'll be competent to fulfill that high level function and approve or disapprove whatever is submitted to us, right? All right, so the next thing on our agenda, let me get rid of that, is, where are we? Philippe, you're on. Annual
Awesome.
performance review of the
Yes.
executive director.
No, and I think so in terms of what I did is I reached out to DAS to talk to them just because I think that the last information that we had was that there was supposed to be a performance review starting in June. And if we wanted to participate in that, we had no sort of idea of how that was going to happen and transpire. So I did reach out. I had an opportunity to meet with, get their name right. I met with Krista Campbell at the Department of Administrative Services. Um, and the biggest, most important thing I have to say is that the review is actually scheduled for next June. It's not actually, it wasn't, at least at the last time I checked, on their actual schedule yet, but it's scheduled for next June. Um, and was provided, and I'm happy to share this. I don't know what the best way to do that, maybe to email it tomorrow. It was provided with, some external facing review process materials from Krista about what happens during those reviews. We will get reached out to with a significant amount of time before that. She's happy to come to speak to the board as a whole about that process. Um, I did inquire about how boards and other agencies kind of work with the Gallup process. Um, and seems like most of them don't actually add much to it, but some smaller boards and commissions will add individual questions. And so um, the way So I think the good news is this is not an urgent situation anymore. It's not happening right now, and if we want to be involved, we don't have to act immediately. Um, I think the question for us is a little bigger and more theoretical of, do we have any independent, do we want to, or is there already any board unified board understanding of executive director effectiveness or job function or any of those things. And if there is, it would probably be helpful to share it because I don't know what it is. And if there's not, is it something we want to create prior to June 2027 to help facilitate the mandated DAS survey?
I am, so there have been two executive directors since I've been on the commission. And I am unaware that there has ever been a board definition of the job function. I mean, there's a statutory definition of the job function, but going beyond the statutory definition in terms of how the executive director does what the statute says he or she is supposed to do. I am not aware of one, and I'm unaware that the board has ever undertaken to evaluate the executive director's performance. So I think that it's ripe for the question that you have asked, which is, do we think there should be some guidelines or definitions, and do we want to evaluate the executive director? Or do we just want to defer to the DAS Gallup review. How often does that review happen, Philippe? Do you know?
I was told that, but I don't remember off the top of my head. I think it was once every 2 or 4.
Yeah.
But I will send what I got tomorrow to disseminate among folks. Um,
So is
and
that, do you or anybody else have thoughts on whether we want to do more than that?
I mean, I'm looking at the statutory definition since you reminded me that it is there, and it's pretty granular.
But we haven't evaluated whether the executive director is doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Should we?
Um,
So one thought that I have, um, policies should be made based on the worst case scenario. I mean, that's one way to think about it. So, you know, if we have an executive director who everybody kind of likes and seems to be, doing a pretty good job and is kind of on the same wavelength as the people on the board, the need to have some kind of formal definitions and evaluation may not seem very pressing. The time may come when this agency has an executive director who is not on the same wavelength and not liked by everybody, and people may think is not doing a competent job. And so the question, and I'm not saying that's going to happen, I'm just, we're all trained to think of worst case scenarios, right? So that's it. And so the question is, do we want to have a mechanism in place while things are good? Or do we want to wait and try to put a mechanism in place in the event that things are not good? That's one way to think about this.
Yeah, I think until I see the materials, it's really hard to comment. I mean, I don't have a sense of how comprehensive that is. And I know, Susan, you're talking about sort of timing here, since it sounds like that DOS review wouldn't take place until a year from now. And maybe the question is whether we want to do something in the interim or not. But I think as a first step, I'd like to just look at the materials that Philippe was able to get. Were those pretty comprehensive, Philippe?
I'd say medium. I mean, yeah, I wouldn't say comprehensive. No, actually, I'm going to go back and change my answer to not comprehensive, just overview.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it has questions and process. I think it's helpful, but I wouldn't say it's comprehensive.
So there isn't one consistent process that's utilized by DOS to evaluate executive.
There is.
There
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
There is. I guess understanding what that is would be, at least for me, a first step before seeing if we really need to have some kind of supplemental process in place. To the extent that process, the DOS process, is not um, specific to this agency, it seems like that's the area where we may, would perhaps want to have some supplemental questions. Um, but yeah, I just don't have a feel for what the DOS process is at all. So yeah, maybe revisit when we have a chance to review that.
Absolutely. I mean, we have a committee meeting every month.
Yeah.
We can't I believe, let's say, I am not sure whether we can receive materials outside the scope of a public meeting, even if we don't discuss them, or we have to wait till the public meeting is noticed and the agenda and the materials are attached to the agenda. I don't know the answer to that. I will try to find out the answer to that.
Well, I did send it tomorrow already, so yeah. Um,
I'll find the answer to that. If we can circulate them to the committee just to look at, and we're not going to talk about it outside of a public meeting, then I'll get Mara to send it out. If we have to wait until they get attached to an agenda and made public.
there's probably also available on the DAS website, or somewhere, and maybe we could find where the link is and talk, and just everyone can go to the link.
If you can find the link on the desk, because you know what you're looking for. I don't know what you're
Yeah,
looking
no, you're true. It's
for.
true. Yeah,
If you can find the link and tell Mara the address for the link,
yeah,
give her
that
the
I,
link. I'm sure she can send us a link.
yeah. Okay,
Yeah. All right.
I'll take a look.
And
And
then,
just
we just won't talk about it until the next subcommittee meeting,
yeah.
right? Okay.
I just my thought on I totally agree, Susan, that we're making policies for a worst case scenario. I guess the problem is when there's so many policies that not everyone knows them because we are, a volunteer board, um and there's change and turnover that it I think it's just important when we make policies for the commission that we realize that there are so many policies that exist on so many different levels, and that the effectiveness is only um, to the extent that they're both able to be maintained and able to be disseminated.
I'm just thinking of something as simple as this policy. Every year in June, every year in October, whatever, every year and pick a month, the board will provide the members with the statutory definition of the executive director's duties and ask for input on whether the board member believes the executive director is doing a good job, passable job, bad job on each one of these duties. Period. End. That's the policy. It gets followed that month of whatever the month is, every September. Everybody on the board gets a list of the duties. For each duty says good job, passable job, bad job. It gets sent to the chair of the board. And for all of the things that there are senses that the executive director is not doing a good job, it can be put on the board agenda and discussed. That's all I'm talking about, right?
I like that it's simple.
Yeah,
It is simple.
I like the simplicity of that.
And all we would have to do is figure out the month. And then we could do it. And then we could answer the KPM question when it asks if we're reviewing the executive director. We could say, yeah, we are. Right? And that would be good for our KPMs.
It's true. Yeah, I mean, I think just I agree that anything that we do, we should try to keep as simple and as plain language as possible in those.
Well, if everybody on this subcommittee likes that idea, I can put it on the agenda for the next board meeting.
I like that idea.
All
I do
right.
too.
Haley, you here? All right, she's maybe distracted. Okay, I will go ahead and talk to Rob about getting that on the agenda.
Would it be scheduled to correspond in time with the DOS review next June?
My preference would be to not schedule it with the DOS. It would be
Mhm.
something that we could do ahead of time, and that would help us participate in the DOS.
Okay.
I mean, that's
Makes
just my.
sense.
So the question is, do you want to do it in the fall or you want to do it in the spring? I don't think it matters. The commission, if the commission decides to do this, it can pick a month. Shouldn't be December. Everybody will be in the holiday spirit. They won't want to criticize anybody.
About October.
You like October?
I mean, I
I
think Kent, I think our executive director might like some feedback, actually, you know.
think he probably would.
Yeah.
But okay, we'll say maybe October, but I'll get something drawn up along the lines. I'll look at the transcript of what it was I said because I didn't write any of it down, and I'll draw something up along those lines and I'll get it on the agenda.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. This has, I think, been a good meeting. Anybody have anything else they'd like to raise for us to discuss today? 5:27. We have come to actually using the full hour and a half. Thank you, everybody. Have a good,
Thank you.
have a good weekend.
Thanks. Bye, you
You
too.
too.